Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to be with you today and to be able to get acquainted with experience of regional development in Albania. The talk that I've prepared was originally planned for the whole hour, so we'll have to move rather quickly. But in this presentation, I will try to give you an overview of our work and understanding of, first of all, the problems at the level of cities, so sustainability and also smartness of cities, which seem to be a very important goal for the future. And in the second part, we will talk a little bit more about sustainability of countries, how countries evolve, how they develop, how to bring together different dimensions of sustainability within the assessment process. And it will be very visual, so I will share with you lots of slides. Some of them will have to think about how to interpret, but I hope we will manage. So, next one, please. So, we will start with a conceptual diagram here, which has a lot of little boxes, but we will need to pay attention first to the internal scheme of things. So here we have the methodology of sustainable cities, which we developed quite a few years ago. And the important thing is that in order to really bring together all the different dimensions of sustainability, we need to talk about sustainable transport, sustainable energy, green design, the issues of quality of life, the issues of green space and biodiversity, also health, water, and waste management. And on the outer range, you will see some specific and measurable indicators that could be identified to support each of these dimensions. You will notice also that there are arrows connecting all these boxes together, which simply means that the analysis and the strategic vision should really bring all these dimensions and unite them. And it is extremely important to actually look at how specific changes in individual of these areas affect all the others. So that's been emphasized in the United Nations framework of indicators on sustainable development, and we very much share this point and also do a lot of work on trade-offs between various dimensions, because we think that this is something that is not so well understood. Thank you. This little slide is chosen here to illustrate the point that cities are massively different, and there are no two cities which are alike. So in this chart we see about 14 different cities around the world, very big and influential ones, including New York and Paris and London and Berlin and Sydney and Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo and Shanghai and Hong Kong and so forth. And we have three dimensions representing the economic side of things with GDP per capita. We also have the environmental dimension represented by the CO2 emissions per capita, and the social dimension in the form of life expectancy. The fact that there is hardly any city that exhibits exactly the same profile illustrates the point of diversity. So we need to understand, first of all, the performance of each of the cities we're dealing with on smart and sustainable indicators. We need to see who is leading, who is following, and then we need to select the appropriate policy tools to address these challenges. So we've identified a panel of about 20 indicators at the city level and managed to collect this data for almost now about 90 cities around the world. It's quite a unique database, I would say. Here we will only briefly speak about individual indicators, but I have to notice that there are indicators of social development, which include Gini index of income differentiation between the rich and the poor, for example. Things like share of population with higher education, but also indicators like the creative industries employment. There are indicators such as those more related to the environmental realm, so the share of renewables in the energy mix, the percentage of municipal waste that is recycled, domestic water consumption, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a comprehensive set of indicators which have been tried and tested. Thanks very much. So I don't know how you're doing with lighting, but the previous slide was supposed to, if you go back one slide, the previous slide was supposed to indicate just one dimension, CO2 emissions per capita around the world. No, the map. Yeah. So we see smaller and larger bubbles, which indicate simply the CO2 emissions per capita for each of these cities. And there's a huge discrepancy. These emissions tend to be lower in places in Latin America, for instance, Sao Paulo, Bogota, and so on, which have largely been connected to hydro energy, just like Albania. And they're very high in places like Australia, with Sydney, and also the United States, Los Angeles, and some places in Europe, and also, most importantly, in China, which is still largely using coal. But also, the energy mix is not the full story, because you have to also look into how your transport sector is structured. Next slide. So in the next few slides, we will see some interesting statistical connections that we've managed to establish between the cities around the world. So in the first one, we look at CO2 emissions, and we try to attribute the changes in CO2 emissions to the fraction of all the trips made by walking, cycling, and public transport. And surprise, surprise, we find a very significant, statistically significant correlation. So everything else being equal, the more you walk, the more you cycle, the more you use public transport, the less your CO2 emissions are going to be. Next one. Now, renewable energies. Well, this is very much in line with what we've expected, but we need some statistical proof. So we can clearly say that based on a database of 90 indicators, the more renewable energy you have in the mix, the less your CO2 emissions are going to be. Next one. Right, this is an interesting one. It comes from the research done by the World Health Organization. It was noticed that the amount of PM, which is particulate matter in the air, is very much correlated with the life expectancy. So there is a direct link between emissions, pollution, and health. And this slide illustrates this in a very statistically significant way. I have to just note that the most problematic places around the world are in cities in India and China, where the PM concentrations are very high, and some better situation is observed in Scandinavian countries, also maybe United States and New York and so on, and some cities in Europe. Next one. Right, what could possibly lead to the improvement of the situation? Well, here we only use the number of underground stations as a proxy, but it could be considered as a proxy for the diversity and the quality of the development of your public transport system in general. Surprisingly enough, there is a highly statistically significant link between the number of underground stations per 100,000 people and PM. So, which means that in a reasonably large city, underground is the only way to go if you really want to address the issue of scale of those spatial transfers of people around the city, and also address the CO2 emissions, because electric cars is an amazing initiative. I welcome it entirely in places where it's happening, but there is also one other aspect, which is space. Traffic congestion is also a geometric problem. So there will be a need to think about this with pedestrianization, with public transport routes, and bicycles trying to go away from the public car, the private car as the main tool. Thank you. Right, so we come to the most important and exciting bit of part one, which is going to be the multidimensional benchmarking of cities. Maybe if you could show the next slide. We have applied the tools which are called multi-criteria decision-aid tools that were first developed in France in the 1960s by Professor Bernard Roy. And as a result, we are able to construct these multidimensional rankings, which look like a web with several cities. You can see that each of them is created under different policy priorities. So the first one you see is under environmental policy priorities. What does it mean? It means that in the whole basket of 20 indicators, the environmental indicators were given larger weight. There's still the whole set, but within this set, environment has been considered a priority. Under these circumstances, at the very top of our web of 14 cities are cities like Singapore, London, and Sydney, and at the bottom, Los Angeles, Shanghai, and Rio de Janeiro. It gives us an indication of where to look for best practices and how to interpret the successes of Singapore, for example, in sustainable urban development, and possibly transfer some of those experiences. Well, let me just say a few words about Singapore. It's a very interesting case. They have, since the independence, introduced a massive program of greening. So they were planting trees, literally, like never before. They have a very strong and highly efficient rapid transit system based on trains. They also introduced some policies to introduce taxes in the form of tradable permits, in a way, on car ownership. So in order to buy a car, you need to go at an auction and bid for a permission to have number plates. This, I would argue, acted as a certain restrictive element to reduce the amount of cars that they have. So the quality of the air is really good, and you can actually walk there and cycle there. It's a very a city that is very easy to navigate. And there are many other initiatives there that deserve to be mentioned, including those related to water. If you look at places like Shanghai, which have seen massive industrialization, enormous growth in both construction and production activities, they came with a cost, with a price tag. So part of that was in the form of air pollution. And we will see in the country charts also how it could be interpreted. Next one. So if we change our priorities, and this is the pleasure of this method, if we change our priorities to economic ones, we will see that the structure of these domination relationships changes a little bit. So at the top we now have Tokyo, Beijing, and London. And at the bottom we still have Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, and Shanghai. So it really gives us an extra angle on the development process and tells us what happens if we change our priorities. If you could show the next slide, please. Under social priorities, the cities in this web of domination change once again. Now we have Berlin coming up quite high, and also Tokyo and London and Sydney keeping their strong position. And at the bottom we still have our regular suspects of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Shanghai, and Los Angeles. The interesting lesson from this, and let us look at the final chart, which will be focused on the smart priorities. At the top we see for the first time Paris coming very high up, with London and Tokyo, and still the same cities pretty much at the bottom. What is interesting here is that there is a lot of discrepancy. And based on the priorities, based on the type of perspective you have, you will be dealing with different leaders and different followers. And this is the particular strength of our method. It really exposes and explains the reality in much more detail than other tools. So I hope we have some more time. So we will briefly look at the development of countries in a dynamic sense. And that's an additional lesson which I hope will be quite useful for you guys here in Albania. Yeah, so we start with a premise that we really need a bigger picture sustainability focused view. And the methodology for that is given to us by an interdisciplinary field called ecological economics. It exists since the mid-1980s. It was initially set up by very concerned social, environmental, and scientists and economists who clearly understood that the current tools of economics are not sufficient to advance on sustainability front. And we've just launched this new book, which I'm happy to show to you. It was launched at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bonn, and it's a collaborative product. It's got chapters by some of the most renowned sustainability thinkers in the world, which include Herman Daly and Robert Ayres and Peter Söderbaum, and a whole range of Herbert Girardet, a whole range of other people. And it really gives a very broad perspective and looks at climate change in cities and macro sustainability assessment, and also values, which is very important. Okay, so next one, please. Right, we are now in a new era of sustainable development goals. There are 17 of them, and we will have to somehow address them in everything we do at the policy level. There is a lot of important topics here. I'm pretty sure I don't need to name each of them individually. I would just like to draw your attention to the process. At the moment, there is a very, very large set of sustainable development goal indicators supporting SDGs that is being developed. The latest set that we reviewed included something like 248 different indicators, and I have to report that some of them are not at the level of clarity and precision that we would like them to be. Well, it should be said that 248 is already quite a lot, and it can be very difficult to manage anyway. But also there are some inaccuracies in terms of the way indicators are formulated, so they should be applicable to each individual country, and sometimes there are weaknesses in the way they are being formulated, and there are repetitions in some areas. So if you could click further. We have developed an understanding which includes a very, very compact set of indicators. So we did it with 9. 3 of them look at the economics, 3 of them look at the environment, and 3 of them look at the social side of things. The other thing that is good about this set of indicators is that it essentially allows us to address all these challenges that have been accompanying unconstrained economic growth around the world, and these are in no particular order: the depletion of resources, environmental pollution, destruction of biodiversity, climatic change, but also social issues such as poverty, sometimes even wars, and happiness. And we really need to adopt this multidisciplinary perspective to try to address the situation and to work on policies in the future. Next one, please. So there have been historically many different attempts to try to conceptualize sustainability at the macro scale. Several examples are given here. So we have the Human Development Index, which is a simple integration of 3 different components in a basket with equal weights. We're dealing with life expectancy, literacy, and also economic growth. What's good about this little index is that it allows to track progress of least developed countries, for which not much data is available, but I would argue that it's not helpful at all for reasonably well-developed countries, for which you really need to look at the details. It's only a very, very aggregated, very, very rough index that is out there. The second one, called adjusted net savings, is used by the World Bank. The main principle is that you take the savings and you subtract, as shares of total output, you subtract certain bad things and you add some good things. So education is considered a good thing, you add it. Depletion of natural resources and environmental pollution are considered bad things and you subtract it. But the thing is that it all is assessed in monetary terms, right? And there are specific, very significant issues with that, because methods to assess environmental damages are to a large extent based on willingness to pay. So what will happen is that the population in the region is asked how much you're willing to pay to preserve clean water or a national park, and then you will get $100 from one and $10 from another and 50 cents from the third. Then you take the average and you multiply it by the number of people, and then some people claim, environmental economists like to claim that this is the value of nature. This is the total, and so on. And ecological economists have been very skeptical about this approach right from the start. And so there are issues in aggregating everything in one dimension, which is money. There are issues you hiding the complexity more than you're revealing it, and also the trade-offs that are present there are not made explicit enough. So these are the two major things I would take the courage to hold against some of these tools that were developed previously. Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare was developed by Herman Daly, and essentially it's a very long list about 30 different corrections to the GDP, which was a very important intellectual step because they thought that, well, okay, so some things are not in the GDP at all, they need to be factored in. For example, the film industry of Hollywood was not in the national accounts of the United States, as we know, for a very long time. So, and the list could go on. But there are other things like, washing the dishes at home is a very popular example. But also some things need to be subtracted because they're not really contributing anything. But, in a way, the author of the GDP, gross domestic product, Simon Kuznets, who got a Nobel Prize for this, was very explicit that, GDP is not a very good measure of welfare. But for some reason, people preferred not to listen to even the inventor of the concept itself. So now we're getting to the fourth option, and it comes from us. It's a proposal to use multidimensional tools, multi-criteria tools. Well, why is that interesting and why is that important? Because multi-criteria tools allow you specifically to look at different dimensions of sustainability. They allow you to look at trade-offs, they allow you to look at sensitivity, and you could really keep things that cannot be converted into single measure as they are in different units. If you could show the next slide. Right, so as I mentioned, we're dealing with a very compact basket of 9 indicators. And for this particular assessment, because it's only a very short introductory lecture, we'll only look at 3, the top level. So we'll look at GDP per capita, CO2 emissions, and life expectancy. And we'll illustrate how multi-criteria tools could be applied in different countries and see what lessons we can draw. Next one. Okay, so the first example is the United States. Next one. Each of these slides, for each country, we'll have 2 slides only. The first one, and we know the principle from the previous part of the lecture, the first one will show the development process under the assumption that GDP is more important than reduction in CO2 emissions and increase in life expectancy. Right? Well, just let's assume we can make that assumption. We are industrialists, we want just GDP. Okay, so the midpoint of those red bars is the aggregate sustainability index. The length of the red bars indicate uncertainty. And let's skip for the moment other difficult technical parts. So on the whole, we see things are going not so bad in the United States from 1995 to 2011, which is the period of our analysis. Next one, please. If we change our priorities, however, if we say that for us CO2 emissions reduction and life expectancy increase is more important than GDP, then the situation changes completely. So we have now a lot of fluctuations, followed by quite a pronounced improvement, but this has been largely attributed to the so-called dash for gas. Right? So the natural gas in the United States became much cheaper, so they had started using it much more, and this way some CO2 emissions reduction would be achieved potentially. Let's move on. Brazil, a very interesting example. Under the GDP priority, we see a very positive trend. Right? Things are going pretty well. Let's see what happens if we change the priorities. Right? So it's not so straightforward anymore. We see some marginal increases up until 2009, after which we start to see the reversal of the trend. This could be an early warning sign, an indication of the so-called turning point. In the next case, we will see it in a much more pronounced way. So the next case is China, a very big economy. And if we look at the priorities of GDP growth, next one, we see this massive growth that happened in China, the industrialization. We know it's a powerhouse in the world, everything is produced there. But if we start looking at change priorities, we reverse them, we think that CO2 emissions reduction and life expectancy are more important than GDP, we clearly see a turning point. And when does it happen? It happens in 2002, roughly speaking. Exactly the moment when China has started this massive industrialization program. So the message is very simple. Even with such a ridiculously simple set of 3 indicators, using the tool, you can actually illustrate whether the development process is harmonious or not. And the next couple of cases will show us how it could be done in a slightly different way. So this is France, and we will see that under the GDP priority and under the CO2 emissions and life expectancy maximization priorities, the trends look pretty similar, which is rather interesting. So the situation is very different from China or Brazil. And if we look at the next case, which is Germany, there will be even more of that. So under GDP priority, we see an improvement, and under the CO2 emissions reductions and life expectancy increase, we also see an improvement. Well, let's pause for a second and think about what could be the possible explanations for this phenomenon. Well, one of them could be stemming from the study that was done by the Economics University in Vienna. And the study looked at the declared priorities that the EU countries have and the precise indicators that are used to measure progress on these priorities. And what was found by the Wirtschaftsuni was quite interesting, because they saw that only 2 EU countries, namely Germany and Estonia, had a perfect clarity and a match between the declared priorities and the indicators used to support them. For most other countries, it was not so straightforward. Right? So they either had very few indicators, or they were not addressing the priorities that were declared. The other one could be this interdepartmental body that was set up to facilitate interdepartmental dialogue. And I would like to stress that this is hugely important. So in order to achieve great progress, you need to bring people from different ministries to the same table, and to make sure that new policies that are introduced, let's say in transport, or the social sphere or the environmental sphere, are cross-checked by experts in different other fields. So we know that our progress is more or less on many fronts and not at the expense of such things. There is of course an elephant in the room here, because in these charts we're dealing with in-country CO2 emissions. And as we know, a lot of the emissions related to consumption are actually outsourced in countries like China. So this is an interesting beginning to a process that I hope will continue in the future. And I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this little discussion, and it will be helpful. So I think we could stop now. Thanks very much. And I'm very happy to answer your questions that you might have. Or we could go on much longer. Right? We have this amazing executive education program set up in Oxford, where we gather for 1 week every summer, and with some of the contributors of this book and many other speakers from different agencies, we discuss green economy in much detail, and we have achieved quite significant success with that, because our participants, well, I would call them students technically speaking, but our participants come from a wide range of organizations that includes United Nations Environment Program, United Nations Development Program, OECD, International Union of Conservation of Nature, World Wildlife Fund, environmental ministries and protection agencies from different countries, also sometimes companies and PhD students and academic representatives. So we've had about 12 different